Spring 269 CE, the banks of the Yangtze River, 3 miles south of Yiling Fortress. The Wu commander stopped counting at mirror 73, overwhelmed by the coordinated flash patterns rippling across the opposite hillside. General Lu Kang, veteran of 17 campaigns and military governor of Jing province, stood in his command pavilion watching what military historians would later call the most sophisticated pre-electric communication network ever deployed in warfare. Across 8 miles of contested river valley, 240 mirror stations relayed tactical information at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph 15 centuries later. What Lu Kang didn't know was that he was witnessing the culmination of a 2,000-year technological tradition that had transformed Chinese warfare from ritualized Bronze Age combat into a science of optical communication, aerial reconnaissance, and psychological operations. The Battle of Yiling, 222 CE. The conflict that established mirror and kite warfare as strategically decisive. But the technology didn't begin there. It began 4 centuries earlier in the workshops of the Warring States period, when craftsmen discovered that polished bronze could be used for more than vanity. The story begins not with military applications, but with a philosophical text from 390 BCE that changed everything. The Mozi, compiled by followers of the philosopher Mozi, contained Book 10, Against Aggression. Embedded within defensive siege tactics was a passage describing optical signaling using polished bronze mirrors mounted on fortress walls. The system appeared deceptively simple. Mirrors positioned at intervals along defensive perimeters could relay information through coordinated flashes, each flash representing a predetermined tactical message. By angling mirrors to reflect sunlight in specific patterns, defenders could communicate across distances that made voice and flag signals useless. The Moists had solved a fundamental military problem: how to coordinate dispersed forces without runners, without delay, and without interception. Their mirror code used 3 basic signals: long flash, short flash, and pause, combined into sequences that conveyed troop movements, enemy positions, and tactical orders. The system worked in daylight conditions across any distance where the mirror reflection remained visible, typically 3 to 5 miles, depending on atmospheric clarity. The Kingdom of Qin, which eventually unified China, adopted Moist mirror signaling around 350 BCE under the military reforms of Xiongnu. The Qin military code included 147 distinct mirror signals, covering everything from enemy cavalry approaching from northwest to supply column delayed, reduced daily rations. General Bai Qi, commanding Qin forces during the conquest campaigns, used mirror networks to coordinate attacks across fronts spanning hundreds of miles. At the Battle of Changping in 260 BCE, Qin forces surrounded and annihilated a Zhao army of 450,000 soldiers through precise coordination enabled by optical signaling. While Zhao commanders relied on mounted couriers requiring hours to transmit orders, Qin tactical updates reached field commanders in minutes. The mirrors themselves represented a significant technological achievement. Bronze alloy composition required precise ratios, typically 70% copper, 25% tin, 5% lead, to achieve optimal reflectivity while maintaining durability. Surfaces were polished using progressively finer abrasives, crushed shell, then river sand, then clay impregnated with iron oxide, finally buffed with silk cloth and plant oils. A properly maintained signal mirror could remain operational for decades. But mirrors solved only half the problem. Optical signaling provided communication across horizontal distances. Battlefield commanders needed vertical reconnaissance, the ability to observe enemy formations beyond immediate line of sight, which is where the kites appeared. The first documented military application appears in the Huainanzi, a philosophical text from 139 BCE that describes wooden birds used to observe enemy dispositions from above. By the Eastern Han Dynasty, circa 100 CE, military kites were standard equipment. Early reconnaissance kites were crude, bamboo frames covered in silk, launched using ground teams and anchor lines, achieving altitudes of perhaps 200 feet. The observer, typically a lightweight soldier or teenage conscript, was suspended in a bamboo basket beneath the kite, equipped with colored flags to signal observations to ground forces. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. A kite observer at 200 feet altitude could see enemy formations 3 miles distant. Cavalry movements, which on level ground remained invisible until emerging from terrain features, became apparent when viewed from altitude. General Ma Yan, commanding Han forces on the southern frontier around 40 CE, pioneered integrated mirror kite operations during campaigns in Vietnam. His tactical innovation was simple but revolutionary. Position kite observers along the front, have them relay reconnaissance to mirror stations using flag signals, then transmit that intelligence back to headquarters via mirror network. The result was real-time battlefield awareness across fronts spanning 50 miles. At the Battle of Jiaoji, his forces confronted a numerically superior Vietnamese army entrenched in defensive positions. Traditional assault would have been suicidal. Instead, Mao Yuan deployed kites to identify weak points in Vietnamese defenses, coordinated flanking movements using mirror signals, and achieved a breakthrough at precisely the moment Vietnamese commanders were repositioning reserves. The Vietnamese commander never understood where the main assault would strike until Han forces were already inside his defensive perimeter. By 200 CE, as the Han Dynasty collapsed into the Three Kingdoms period, mirror kite warfare had reached operational maturity. The three competing kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu, all maintained extensive optical communication networks and aerial reconnaissance capabilities. The Battle of Yiling, summer 222 CE, changed everything. Liu Bei, founding emperor of Shu, invaded Wu territory with an army estimated at 100,000 soldiers seeking revenge for the death of his sworn brother Guan Yu. The campaign began successfully. Shu forces advanced along the Yangtze River Valley, capturing fortifications and pushing deep into Wu territory. Liu Bei established a massive encampment extending along 70 miles of river valley, his forces dispersed among dozens of fortified positions. The Wu commander, Lu Xun, faced an impossible situation. His available forces numbered perhaps 50,000, inadequate for a frontal assault against a numerically superior enemy occupying fortified positions. Lu Xun chose differently. What Lu Xun understood was that the dispersed Shu encampments were individually defensible but collectively vulnerable. The 70-mile front meant reinforcement between positions required hours. Communication relied on mounted couriers. If Wu forces could achieve a breakthrough at a single point while preventing Shu's tactical coordination, the entire position would become untenable. Lu Xun spent months preparing. Wu forces constructed a comprehensive mirror network along ridges parallel to the Shu front, 240 stations positioned to provide overlapping coverage. Each station maintained line of sight with at least 3 others, creating redundant communication paths. Signal codes were updated daily using rotating cipher schedules. Simultaneously, Wu engineers assembled the largest military kite fleet ever deployed. 50 observation kites, each capable of carrying a single observer to altitudes exceeding 300 feet, were positioned along the front. The kites used a new design, box construction with multiple cells, providing stability in the valley's turbulent air currents. The attack began on the night of July 22, 222 CE, but the decisive phase came at dawn. As the light broke, Lu Xun launched every kite simultaneously. Wu observers achieved altitude just as the rising sun provided optimal visibility. What they saw confirmed Lu Xun's tactical assessment. The Shu encampments maintained minimal alert status. Supply depots were poorly positioned and vulnerable to fire. The Wu mirror network transmitted reconnaissance in real time. Lu Xun had divided his forces into 12 independent strike groups, each assigned specific objectives based on aerial intelligence. As kite observers identified weak points, mirror signals redirected strike groups to optimal attack points. But the decisive element wasn't the assault, it was fire. The Yangtze Valley in midsummer is furnace hot, vegetation tinder dry. Shu forces, camped among dense forest, had spent months cutting timber for fortifications and fuel. Lu Xun's strike groups carried incendiary materials, oil-soaked cloth, sulfur compounds, and bamboo fire lances that projected burning materials across defensive perimeters. Kite observers directed fire attacks. Mirror networks coordinated timing. 12 Shu camps ignited simultaneously at points chosen to maximize psychological impact. The fires spread with terrifying speed. Shu soldiers, confronted with flames on multiple sides and unable to receive coherent orders as their communication network collapsed, abandoned fortifications and fled toward river crossings. Liu Bei's command structure disintegrated. Mounted couriers carrying orders found roads blocked by retreating soldiers and advancing Wu forces. By noon, what had been a coordinated defensive position had become a 70-mile panic. Wu forces, guided by continuous kite reconnaissance and coordinating movements via mirror signals, systematically exploited the chaos. The Shu army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Casualty estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000 killed, captured, or missing. Liu Bei himself barely escaped, fleeing with a small bodyguard unit to Baidicheng Fortress, where he died 8 months later. The kingdom of Shu never recovered. But more significant than the tactical outcome was the doctrinal lesson. Lu Xun had demonstrated that information superiority, achieved through systematic reconnaissance and instantaneous communication, could overcome numerical inferiority, defensive positioning, and material disadvantage. The technology spread across Asia. By 250 CE, mirror signaling appeared in military texts from Korea, Vietnam, and as far west as the Sassanid Persian Empire. General Zhuge Liang, Shu's strategic genius who survived Yiling, incorporated mirror networks into every subsequent campaign. The Jin Dynasty, which reunified China in 280 CE, inherited the complete mirror kite infrastructure from all three kingdoms. Archaeological excavations of Jin-period fortifications along the northern border reveal mirror stations positioned every 3 miles, creating a communication network extending from the Pacific coast to the western deserts, a distance exceeding 2,000 miles. Standard military mirrors measured 8 kun, roughly 10 inches in diameter, weighed approximately 2 pounds, and met precise reflectivity standards. Mirror operators underwent training lasting 6 months, learning 240 standard tactical signals. Kite observers needed to weigh less than 130 pounds, possess exceptional vision, and demonstrate no fear of heights. Observer mortality rates were significant, estimated at 15% annually from accidents. The psychological impact on enemies was documented extensively. Northern nomadic tribes found that traditional cavalry advantages had been neutralized. Their movements were observed hours before contact, their strength assessed, and their approach vectors transmitted to defensive forces that could redeploy to optimal positions. But the system had limitations that military theorists understood but couldn't solve. Mirror signaling required clear weather and adequate sunlight. Overcast conditions reduced range. The rain made the operation impossible. Fog rendered the entire network useless. Kites require specific wind conditions. Too little wind prevented launch, too much made it impossible. And the technology was vulnerable to countermeasures. Enemy forces learned to conduct operations during weather conditions that grounded kites and obscured mirror signals. Night marches became standard procedure for armies facing opponents with optical reconnaissance. Yet despite limitations, the technology remained militarily decisive for centuries. Military academies taught optical communication as a core curriculum. The engineering corps maintained networks as critical infrastructure. The apex came during the Sui dynasty's reunification campaigns, 580 to 589 CE. General Yang Su, commanding Sui naval forces during the Yangtze River campaigns, integrated mirror kite warfare with fleet operations to devastating effect. Sui reconnaissance kites identified Chen Dynasty naval dispositions, shore defenses, and supply depots. Mirror networks transmitted this intelligence to Yang Su's headquarters and simultaneously to fleet commanders, enabling real-time tactical coordination. When Yang Su launched the final assault in 589 CE, his forces moved with absolute certainty about enemy positions, defensive capabilities, and optimal attack vectors. The Chen Navy, lacking equivalent reconnaissance, fought blind. Their commanders saw Sui forces appearing at unexpected locations, attacking weak points they hadn't known were weak. The Chen Dynasty collapsed within months. Military historians analyzing the campaign consistently cite information superiority as the decisive factor. The Sui didn't win through superior soldiers, better weapons, or greater numbers. They won because they could see the battlefield clearly while their enemies fought in fog. But the technology that won the reunification contained its own seeds of obsolescence. The Qing dynasty faced enemies unlike those confronted by previous Chinese kingdoms. The Turkic Khaganate to the north and the Tibetan Empire to the west possessed their own versions of mirror kite technology. The technological advantage that had defined Chinese military superiority for 4 centuries was evaporating. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE demonstrated the changed equation. Qing forces confronted Arab armies in Central Asia. Both sides possessed optical communication networks. Both deployed aerial reconnaissance. The technological advantage that Chinese forces had historically relied upon simply didn't exist. Qing forces were defeated. Simultaneously, gunpowder weapons began appearing in Chinese military arsenals. Gunpowder weapons weren't weather-dependent. They worked at night, in fog, during storms. They didn't require years of training or specialized personnel. By the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, mirror networks were maintained primarily for administrative communication rather than tactical battlefield coordination. The specialized training programs that had produced generations of signal operators and observers gradually were discontinued. The technology that had defined Chinese warfare for nearly a millennium faded into historical obscurity. Yet the doctrinal legacy persisted. Song Dynasty military theorists recognized that success in warfare derived from information superiority and rapid communication rather than exotic technology. The strategic principles that mirror kite operations had demonstrated, continuous reconnaissance, real-time intelligence distribution, and coordinated tactical response, remained valid even as the specific technologies became obsolete. When Genghis Khan's Mongol forces swept across Asia in the 13th century, they carried with them Chinese military advisors who understood the principles of information warfare. Mongol campaigns demonstrated extraordinary coordination across vast distances, precise timing in convergent attacks, and systematic intelligence gathering. The technology was different, mounted couriers instead of mirrors, scouts instead of kites, but the doctrine was recognizably descended from the Three Kingdoms era. Western military historians encountering this evidence faced comprehension problems. The standard narrative positioned technological innovation as a European achievement. The concept that Chinese armies in the 3rd century possessed systematic optical communication networks that functioned as effectively as 18th century semaphore systems contradicted established understanding. The reassessment began in the 1960s when military historians studying the Three Kingdoms period campaigns recognized that the documented tactical coordination was impossible with conventional command and control methods. Either the historical accounts were fabricated, or Chinese armies possessed communication capabilities that historians had dismissed. Systematic analysis revealed technically detailed descriptions of optical signaling systems that were internally consistent, operationally practical, and entirely feasible given Bronze Age metallurgy and bamboo construction techniques. Modern engineers constructing replicas confirmed they functioned as specified, achieving readable signal transmission across 5-mile distances. The comparison with Western military development is stark. European armies didn't develop systematic optical communication until the late 18th century, when French engineer Claude Chappe invented the semaphore telegraph in 1792. Napoleon's armies used Chappe's system extensively, but Chinese forces had achieved comparable capabilities 15 centuries earlier. Aerial reconnaissance in Western warfare began with balloon observation during the French Revolutionary Wars, again in the 1790s. Chinese armies had deployed manned kites for reconnaissance purposes since at least the 2nd century CE, 1,200 years earlier. What ultimately defeated mirror kite warfare wasn't superior technology, it was strategic obsolescence. The warfare that Chinese kingdoms fought during the Warring States and Three Kingdoms period created conditions where mirror kite systems provided a decisive advantage. But Song Dynasty warfare faced different challenges. Mongol cavalry tactics emphasized extreme mobility, dispersed operations, and attacks timed to exploit weather conditions that grounded Chinese reconnaissance systems. By the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 CE, mirror kite technology was archaic. Military budgets prioritized cannon manufacturing, firearm production, and gunpowder stockpiles. The specialized corps that had maintained mirror networks was disbanded. Yet the conceptual legacy influenced Chinese military thought into the modern era. Mao Zedong, studying classical Chinese military texts during the Chinese Civil War, absorbed the fundamental lesson: warfare is decided by information and coordination rather than weapons and numbers. His guerrilla warfare doctrine emphasized intelligence gathering, rapid communication, and concentrated action at weak points, concepts directly descended from Three Kingdoms era mirror kite operations. Modern Chinese military doctrine continues to emphasize what PLA strategists call information dominance, the requirement to see, communicate, and coordinate faster than opponents. The technology is different: satellites instead of kites, encrypted radio instead of mirrors, but the strategic framework traces directly to battles fought 17 centuries ago. The ultimate irony is that Western military forces independently rediscovered these principles. The U.S. military's revolution in military affairs during the 1990s emphasized exactly what Lu Xun demonstrated in 222 CE, that real-time reconnaissance integrated with instantaneous communication enables smaller forces to achieve overwhelming tactical effects. The 2003 Iraq invasion demonstrated mirror kite warfare principles using 21st century technology. U.S. forces possessed comprehensive aerial reconnaissance, secure real-time communication, and precise coordination across vast distances. Iraqi forces, lacking equivalent capabilities, fought blind. The operational outcome mirrored Yiling. A numerically smaller force using information superiority achieved a decisive victory. The death of mirror kite warfare wasn't a failure, it was evolution. The technology served Chinese military forces for 1,000 years, enabling victories that would have been impossible otherwise. When the strategic environment changed and better technologies emerged, the specific systems became obsolete, but the concepts persisted. Every modern military force understands that information superiority determines outcomes. Every advanced military invests heavily in reconnaissance, communication, and command and control systems. These aren't new concepts, they're ancient concepts first systematized by Chinese military theorists and demonstrated operationally by armies using bronze mirrors and bamboo kites. The Battle of Yiling remains one of the most significant military engagements in human history, not because of casualty counts or territorial consequences, but because it demonstrated conclusively that information dominance defeats material superiority. Liu Bei's army was destroyed not by superior weapons or greater numbers, it was destroyed because Wu forces could see the battlefield clearly while Shu forces fought blind, because Wu commanders communicated instantly while Shu orders arrived too late, and because Wu tactical coordination was precise while Shu responses were confused. The generals who used mirrors and kites weren't primitive. They were applying the same fundamental insight that guides modern warfare. Warfare is decided by information and coordination. Lu Xun understood this standing in his command pavilion in 222 CE, watching mirror flashes relay kite observations across 8 miles of contested terrain. Modern military planners understand this, investing billions in reconnaissance satellites and communication networks that do exactly what Chinese mirror kite systems did, provide information superiority. The technology that enabled one forgotten army to win a war using kites and mirrors died centuries ago. The doctrine that made the technology effective remains contemporary. Bronze mirrors reflecting sunlight delivered the same strategic effect as encrypted satellite communications. Bamboo kites carrying teenage observers provided the same tactical advantage as reconnaissance drones. Lu Xun's victory at Yiling wasn't achieved through exotic weapons or mysterious tactics. It was achieved through the systematic application of proven technologies integrated into a coherent operational doctrine. The mirrors weren't magic, the kites weren't mysterious, they were simply the most advanced command and control technology available in the 3rd century CE. The lesson persists. Warfare is decided by the side that sees clearly, communicates effectively, and coordinates precisely, which was precisely what Lu Xun demonstrated in 222 CE. The mirror-tight systems worked, not for seconds in laboratory conditions, but for centuries across the largest military theaters in world history. The generals weren't forgotten because they failed. They were forgotten because they succeeded so completely that their innovations became invisible, absorbed into military doctrine as fundamental truth. Lu Xun didn't invent information warfare. He perfected it using the technologies available, demonstrated its decisive effectiveness, and established principles that remain valid across technological revolutions. The battles fought with kites and mirrors ended 15 centuries ago. The war for information dominance continues, fought with different tools but identical concepts, by armies that unknowingly execute tactical doctrines first demonstrated along the Yangtze River when bronze mirrors flashed coordination signals and bamboo kites carried observers into morning skies.